My name is Tori Collins. Right now, the challenge is your race. People are judging you based on your race and your class, and most of the times your class is based on your race, and that's unfortunate.
It's never been a peaceful revolution. Knowing thyself is the solution. Water me down says confusion. No more statistics, facts are proven. Everything though comes to an conclusion. Ending the process of misusing. Ending believing in illusion. For a minute, let's change with the truism.
My name is Jair Carrasco. As we see institutional powers gain more power and taking it away from the people, I think it's very important to collectively produce a movement that helps and supports local communities, not just here, but serves as an example nationally.
You understand what I'm saying? So basically, we are the people who got to put our foot in that door and ask the councils and tell them we want more of all us to come together. Blacks, Hispanics, whites, all this need to come together. It ain't just one color, it's all the colors come together.
My name is Everett Bradford. Being a black man in America, no matter how far you get, if the system doesn't allow for equity, then you're one police stop away, one missed paycheck away, one foreclosure away, or one stereotype away from being in a situation that you have no control over.
Let's rebel for a minute. Hey. Prevail for a minute, be bold for a minute, let the truth be told for a minute, time to disrupt for a minute, not all about money for a minute, but be willing for a minute.
My name is Linda Brown. The trauma that I am working through, it cannot be done by myself. I need other people on the planet to help. And so if I don't put myself out there, then I can't be a part of the solution.
Ready to build for a minute, to empower for a minute, to go get it for a minute. Let's pull it together for a minute, by sticking together for a minute, doing it together for a minute, by using our minds for a minute.
Sorry to say that website is not operable right now, but we're here today and doing this work as part of Empower DC. So I thank you for taking some time out of your busy, beautiful September Saturday to join us. We have a lot of people who are interested in today's session. There was about 80 people who signed up. So we'll be sharing this recording with folks who couldn't make it physically today, as well as we have a second session scheduled for this Tuesday, September 20th at 10 a.m. And so what I'm going to do is, again, ask everybody to please put in the chat if you're representing a neighborhood, a ward, an ANC, an organization, please do that. I'm going to run through a couple of slides to just sort of lay the groundwork for today's discussion. Then we have a short presentation from Alexander Kane from the Office of Attorney General, just sort of a zoning 101. And then we're going to get into what is the racial equity analysis tool that the Zoning Commission has developed. We're going to look at it and we're going to offer some of our recommendations and feedback and thoughts on that tool. Then we're going to make sure everybody knows how to participate in the roundtable that the Zoning Commission is having next week on Thursday. So I'm going to repeat all of that, so don't worry, but welcome to everybody who's joining. Please just go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And as we do that, I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. All right, so let me go back and properly introduce myself as well. I'm Parisa Naruzzi, Director of Empower DC. Thank you all for joining today. We are talking about racial equity analysis within zoning, in particular, zoning and the development review that takes place there. But first, if you're new to Empower DC, we've been around since 2003. I'm the co-founder. So we're coming up on our 20th anniversary next year. We're citywide. We engage in community organizing for the purpose of building power to address systemic change, to bring about systemic change The issues that we're really focused on, which are intersectional, and they represent, you know, multiple specific issues in the neighborhoods, but big buckets: equitable development, environmental justice, and racial equity are our three main focus areas. And you may be familiar with our 20-year campaign around Crummell School in Ivy City, our work around the comprehensive plan that we're talking about a little bit today, as well as work in Berry Farm, etc. So today's agenda, as I kind of mentioned, we're going to just have a very brief introduction conversation about what is racial equity. Then we're going to really start looking at the comprehensive plan, what the language is in the comp plan that spurred this requirement for the Zoning Commission to do racial equity analysis. We'll have a brief zoning 101 from Office of Attorney General, and then we'll really dig into this upcoming roundtable next Thursday, recommendations that we've developed to get your feedback, etc. So I want to open it just for a couple of minutes, and I want to ask people to just be really mindful about how much time and space we take for this. But if you could, in the chat, put some of your feedback. What is racial equity? What does that mean to you? When you hear that we're going to do analysis of racial equity, what do you expect that would incorporate and involve? And I'm going to call on a couple of people to actually also unmute if I could. I wonder, Linda Brown, would you be willing to share your perspective of what is racial equity to you?
Oh, hi, everyone. Hi, Marissa. Sorry. You caught me off guard.
I sure did. Sorry. But I know you know this topic well, so I'd love to hear a couple words from you.
Well, racial equity, what it means to me is to level the playing field in a lot of areas and aspects of our lives, health, housing, and financially, just to give people the resources and to better their lives. So I'll just leave it there. Like I said, you could be a guard.
No, I know. I appreciate that, Linda. Thank you so much. And one thing that I really appreciate about your response is that, yes, this is about improving people's lives, right? This is not just about putting words on paper. And so that is a real measurement that we need to be looking at as a city. Are we achieving real outcomes, right? We want to move the needle. We don't want to just have some great words on paper about, you know, racial equity. Chairman Phil Mendelson has joined us. Phil, can I put you on the spot? Would you share with us what, when you think of racial equity, what does racial equity mean to you?
It means outcomes that are not predetermined by race or income, avoiding disparate impacts, being sensitive to inequalities that exist, and ensuring that actions do not have a disparate effect based on race or income.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'll invite you to share a few more words later on if that's okay, but I want to get a little further into the agenda before I do that. One of the things that I appreciate about your response as well is, you know, we need to be intentional, right? This is intentional. We can't, this doesn't just happen on its own, right? We've learned that, right? We've seen with it, first of all, there was intentional policies that created racial inequity and exacerbated racial inequity. So we have to identify and go back and cure those, but also we have to be very intentional about the measures that we're taking now to correct it. There's an organization called Race Forward that I encourage you to check out. It's a national level organization that works with groups around the country. Empower DC is one of those groups. This is a definition that Race Forward has put forward about racial equity. And I think it's important that it talks about a process. It talks about being intentional and continual, a practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures. It's very active, in other words, right? There's no passive way to address racial equity. So I think that's something that we really need to look at as we look at, what are the actions of the zoning commission? What are the actions of the developers? It's nothing passive is going to have this this outcome. I would just say Race Forward does have a national conference that they do every year called Facing Race. It's coming up actually November 17th, and you can even join online. And folks in our racial equity cohort have attended the different trainings that Race Forward offers as well. And so now we get into why are we here? So there has been great effort to implement some changes in the comprehensive plan that call for racial equity analysis within planning and zoning development review. We know that development has played a key role in racial inequity historically with redlining, et cetera, racial codes, all of that, but also currently, right? And we know that the city in its rapid growth over the last couple of decades contributed to the mass displacement of Black residents, tens of thousands of Black residents. And so we want to see meaningful implementation of the racial equity requirements. We want to stop the displacement of Black and Brown residents, and we want to repair harm that has been done due to racist policies and systems. The comprehensive plan, I think many of you are somewhat familiar. I think a lot of you participated in the 4 to 5 year process that ended last May to amend the plan. It's considered the guiding framework for development. It's a 20-year plan. And Alexander Kane's going to go into it a little bit more, but just to give you a snapshot, that now there's actually many sections throughout the comp plan that call for racial equity analysis. Today, we're talking specifically about within zoning and development review. However, I encourage you to go back and look at what it says within small area plans and transportation planning, industrial land use, housing analysis, workforce, et cetera. There's many places throughout the plan that specifically say a racial equity lens should be applied. And so we really do as a city need to unite around making sure that we're doing this comprehensively throughout, the DC government agencies. It cannot just be here and there. But this is some of the language in the comp plan about defining racial equity. It similarly to what the chairman said, it talks about racial equity being defined as the moment when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved. But I think also in the second piece there, where it talks about the process, so racial equity, again, being as much of a process as an outcome. And that's something that, this conversation is really rooted in process, right? Like, how are we incorporating processes that lead to outcomes, right? That are shifting the needle on racial equity. As a process, it says we apply a racial equity lens when those most impacted by structural racism are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. I highlighted that section because, again, as a process, we firmly believe that you can't have an equitable outcome if you don't have an equitable process. And that is something that we are going to also have to confront at the Zoning Commission, because while we're discussing a tool that would be used to evaluate development, the zoning process as a whole is inequitable, right? So we actually have to look at the structure within we're doing this process. Who even knows about zoning, right? Who's ever, been informed of their rights within zoning, who actually has standing, who actually is given notice. So these are types of things that we'll discuss today as well. And the comp plan goes on. One of the things that was added was really to define what does it mean to use a racial equity lens. And we appreciated the fact that this was incorporated into the plan to give more specific guidance for the different agencies that are being told, hey, you have to use a racial equity lens. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's a few bullet points: to identify and consider past and current systemic racial inequities, to identify who benefits or who is burdened from a decision, to disaggregate data by race and analyze data considering different impacts and outcomes by race, very important, and to evaluate the program activity or decisions to identify measures such as policy plans or requirements that reduce systemic racial inequities, eliminate race as a predictor of results, and promote equitable development. Equitable development. Okay. We don't see a lot of equitable development in DC. I'm just going to put it out there. And I say that as somebody who has a degree in community economic development, was part of a limited equity housing cooperative for 10 years. We see a lot of development that is driven by developers. And when I talk about equitable development, I'm thinking of development that is driven by communities and is meant to serve the needs of communities. So I just want to dig into this a little bit more, because again, we're talking about the development arena. The Zoning Commission plays a key role in approving development. For 20 years or so, they pretty much were approving the development that came before them without significant changes. And that corresponded with the time period in which we saw such rapid gentrification that tens of thousands of Black residents were displaced. So this is a key piece, right? The development arena is a key piece. Now we recognize zoning commission itself is not going to be able to solve all of these issues, right? But they do have a key role to play. And so equitable development is defined in the comprehensive plan as well. And again, highlights the participatory approach for meeting the needs of underserved communities, right? And I, again, just want to really highlight it. The participatory, if we don't have meaningful involvement of the people we say we're trying to serve, or say we're trying to help, or say are not burdened, or say, you know, then we are not actually being meaningful in our racial equity work. So let's see if there's anything. So, and in the last here, it says, it must do so that encourage choice, not displacement, and build the capacity of vulnerable, marginalized, and low-income communities to fully and substantively participate in decision-making processes and share in the benefits of the growth while not unduly bearing its negative impacts. So this is the standard that we want to meet, right? One more definition in the comp plan. The comp plan is very specific when it comes to zoning, right? So here's a section where and I highlighted in yellow, that it talks about creating and implementing tools and training to assist district governments in evaluating and implementing the comprehensive plan's policies through an equity, particularly a racial equity lens. This includes tools to use as part of the development review process, preparations of plans, zoning code updates, and preparation of the capital improvement program. And then it says, this shall specifically include a process for the Zoning Commission to evaluate all actions through a racial equity lens as part of its comprehensive plan consistency analysis. So Alex is going to explain a little bit what does that comprehensive plan consistency mean, and why, you know, this is a big piece of what the Zoning Commission does. But again, if there's any attempt to say, well, racial equity should not be, you know, the analysis shouldn't be applied to these types of decisions, just those. Well, this is pretty clear. This is all actions, right? So I want to just remind us that I think the comprehensive plan sets a standard here that so far we haven't seen carried out. Okay, with that, I'm going to actually come back to this in a minute, and I'm going to invite Alex. I'm going to make her able to share her screen. And as I'm doing that, Alex, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself and land use division?
Well, thank you, Parisa, for having us here today. I'm very excited about this racial equity analysis effort. Glad to see so many people who are interested here today. So a little bit about the equitable land use section of OAG. We came into being last fall, and we are charged with advocating for the public interest in zoning and development matters in the district as part of the Attorney General's sort of broader public interest mission. So sort of what we've done with that is focused on sort of 4 key areas, which is affordable housing, environmental justice, racial equity, and what we've termed procedural equity, which is sort of why we're here today. Procedural equity for us involves sort of breaking down barriers and making the process a little bit easier to understand, trying to inform people of their rights so that people are able to participate more fully in the process. So here today, as Bruce said, to sort of give a little bit of the broader context of the sort of the zoning and planning processes that this racial equity analysis is fitting into, to hopefully sort of help everyone as they're trying to figure out how to go into the roundtable on Thursday. I'll just note that my colleagues, Maximilian Tondro, the section chief, and Lily Bullitt are also here today. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop questions into the chat, and we will respond to them.
Alex, do you want me to share the slides, or would you prefer to do that?
I can do that. Let me just pull it up. Okay, is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Give me a minute here to figure out my controls. Okay. So the sort of the key sort of starting point in considering planning and zoning in the district is to understand that those are two sort of different concepts. Planning, as embodied in DC by the comprehensive plan, is sort of a long-term aspirational view of how development in the district is supposed to proceed. So looking at sort of broad policy areas like housing and environmental issues and transportation, and really trying to sort of game out, over a 20-year period, how do we want to see the district grow in these areas? Where are we anticipating growth and that kind of thing? So the comprehensive plan is drafted by the Office of Planning on behalf of the mayor. It is subsequently reviewed and approved by council. So the zoning commission does not have a role in the adoption of the comprehensive plan. They are outside of that process. However, the comprehensive plan does sort of set the framework for the zoning regulations. So the zoning regulations take those aspirational goals of the comprehensive plan and turn them into sort of the material built reality that we see in the district every day. So how tall buildings can be, how dense development can be, where different uses can be located, all of that comes out of the zoning regulations. And the zoning regulations are adopted by the zoning commission. So typically they're proposed by the Office of Planning. However, residents and other district agencies can propose them as well. But they are reviewed and then subsequently adopted by the commission, along with the zoning maps themselves, which designate the different zones throughout the district. So in considering the comprehensive plan, as Chris said, this is a very big document. It has a lot of different elements, but it can sort of be broken down into three main parts. There are the two main maps, the generalized policy map, the future land use map, and then the written elements, which are broken into the citywide and the area elements. And again, so we're talking about the zoning commission's role, which we'll get to a little bit more in a minute. The zoning commission is charged with sort of balancing out all of these different elements as they go through their analysis. So a little bit about the GPM and the FLUM. So the generalized policy map designates areas for conservation, enhancement, or change, again, in that sort of long period of the comprehensive plan. And the future land use map designates anticipated future land uses for these different areas and also sort of sets sort of broad guidelines in terms of how dense the development can be. And then in terms of the different written elements, we have the framework element, which is sort of the sort of overview, the implementation and interpretation section. So that's where a lot of those sections dealing with racial equity that Parisa had up earlier are located. But then there are also what are called citywide elements and area elements. So citywide elements deal with sort of broad district-wide policies. So again, sort of big categories like housing, environmental protection, historic preservation, infrastructure. And then there are also area elements. So these are areas, the planning areas defined by OP. There are 10 of them in the district, and these have specific policies that are tagged to those specific areas and their needs. So some areas will have a greater focus on housing, perhaps. Some may have a greater focus on environmental quality. It depends on sort of the needs of that specific area. And I would just note that the issue of racial equity does come up in all of those elements, but sort of the primary sections that we're going to be looking at today are in the implementation and framework sections. And then one other thing I just want to call out are small area plans, which I think Parisa also mentioned. So these are not always officially part of the comp plan unless they've been adopted as an amendment to it, but these deal with sort of smaller neighborhood areas. So it's a sort of hyper local focus on the planning goals of a specific area. So as some of you may be aware, there are a couple that are going through right now. Chevy Chase was one of the most recent ones. But again, this is looking at just sort of a very small local area. And then just in terms of sort of general roles and who's involved in the zoning process. So first of all, the zoning commission. So as you said, the zoning commission is charged with reviewing the amendments to both the zoning regulations and the zoning maps. And they also review applications for sort of large scale projects. So these are going to be things like planned unit developments, design reviews, campus plans. Projects that are larger in scale are going to impact a greater number of residents and sort of bring into play broader public policy issues. There's also the Board of Zoning Adjustment, who deals with special exceptions and variances. I'm going to sort of leave them to the side for right now because they're not the main focus of what we're talking about today, but they are the other sort of decision-making body when it comes to zoning. Then in terms of the other agencies that deal with the commission, there's the Office of Zoning, which provides the administrative and legal support for the commission. And then there's also the Office of Planning. So the Office of Planning serves as the district's planning experts, and they're sort of broken into two broad categories. There are the planners who deal with sort of that long-term comprehensive planning, so looking ahead, sort of these long-term goals, doing the comprehensive plan, doing the small area plans. And then there's also the folks who do the development review. So that's the review of the individual applications that come before either the commission or the board. Then there's also ANCs, which I know we have a couple of ANC commissioners here today. So they are, of course, automatic parties to zoning commission and board cases. They're able to represent the interests of their constituencies in the surrounding neighborhood in zoning matters. And then over in DCRA, there's the Office of the Zoning Administrator, which is charged with enforcement of the zoning regulations, through the review of building permits and applications for certificates of occupancy. Okay, so then in terms of zoning commission cases and sort of how all of this comes together, again, sort of I've run through the main types of cases that the commission is considering. So you have applications and amendments sort of in two big buckets. But sort of the common thread through all of these is consistency with the comprehensive plan. And the way it's actually phrased, the requirement for the commission is that they have to make a determination that an application is not inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. And not inconsistent is kind of a funky term, but it's designed to sort of encapsulate the fact that there are so many different elements in the comprehensive plan that the commission has to consider, and that they sort of have to weigh all of them and sort of on balance decide whether an application is or is not consistent with the comprehensive plan. So sort of to Paris's point, the racial equity analysis has now been incorporated into the comprehensive plan and is incorporated into the commission's review of comp plan consistency. So it is sort of part of this common thread through all of these applications. As she noted, it applies to all zoning actions across the board. And then don't want to spend too much, because I know all of this Bruce has already covered a lot of this. But again, in terms of the specific language for racial equity, there is the charge that the commission include this as part of their comprehensive plan consistency analysis. So again, anytime there's a zoning action that requires that, this is something that the commission is now charged to consider. And it is fairly clear in terms of, what this racial equity lens should involve. And those are those 4 bullet points that Parisa covered. So identifying past and current systemic racial inequities, identifying benefited and burdened groups, disaggregating data by race, analyzing that data, again, disaggregated by race, and then evaluating the specific program or action within that context. So that's a very, very quick zoning in a nutshell. I know that's a lot of information at once. Hopefully some of it was understandable. As you said before, zoning is its own sort of weird little world. But if there are any questions on any of that, please feel free to raise your hand or drop questions into the chat.
Alex, and I am going to ask right now that we hold questions a little bit longer. I want people to put them in the chat, but if you have one that you want to ask out loud, we're going to have some discussion in a little bit. But also, Alex, do you want to give out just your contact information for the land use section and describe what type of support can people come to your division for?
Yeah, sure. So again, sort of, I guess the 3 main ways that we are getting involved in zoning actions right now are we have proposed text amendments to the zoning regulations. So these are, again, changes to the zoning regulations, advocating for those 4 main areas. Affordable housing has been a big focus of ours, but also some procedural changes to try and, make the process fairer and sort of easier for people to participate in. We do also intervene in specific cases if we feel they raise a public interest matter. And then it's doing outreach to community groups, working with community groups, ANCs, residents, again, really to try and explain how the process works and sort of what people's rights are in that process. As I keep saying, zoning is a very strange world, but it does have real world impacts on people's neighborhoods, their communities. So it is really important that they are involved in those decisions and they understand sort of what's going on and how they can be involved. So we are there for that. So after today, if you have, questions about racial equity or just sort of zoning matters generally, please feel free to reach out to us. We love hearing from people. We love being able to, do what we can to help, but it's also very helpful for us to understand sort of what issues people are facing in their neighborhoods so that we can sort of see, okay, sort of big picture, what are some other issues that we need to look at?
Thank you so much. And it's been great working with the land use division. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some additional slides, Alex. But what I would encourage folks also, if this is something that you're interested in and you want to continue in this work, Empower DC is convening regular meetings with Alex and her team and continuing to really explore those text amendments to give input even into the work that OAG is doing, as well as to get support from them as we figure out ways to intervene ourselves. As Alex mentioned, anybody can introduce a text amendment or even a map amendment at zoning. Of course, the zoning commission doesn't have to set a hearing for it or move it forward. And we're in a position right now where some of OAG's amendments that they've proposed are sitting without any action yet. This is where we are today. So just to repeat a little bit, the comprehensive plan amendments with this racial equity requirement were passed by the council in May of 2021. That became law in August of 2021. And since that time, it's the legal mandate that this should be implemented. We've been tracking that, and we do have some examples, not to share today, but that we can share at future meetings of what has that looked like so far. It's been very deficient. It's been, a little verbiage, a paragraph here and there, repeating some statistics and basically saying, hey, this has inclusionary zoning units, so it's affordable. There's affordable housing and it addresses racial equity. No. We all know that that's insufficient, right? And so we don't even have to spend a lot of time on that. But I think it was in April of this year, the Zoning Commission released what they call their draft racial equity tool, right? And we had been through the oversight hearings. It was interesting. We had been through the oversight hearings and the budget hearings saying they're not doing it. They're not doing the racial equity analysis that's required. And Anita Cozart, interim director of the Office of Planning, and Sarah Barden, director of the Office of Zoning, kept saying, no, we're doing it. And then after that, they released this. Okay, so there's two parts to it, but the first part just lists the chapters of the comp plan, just that Alex had already gone over. It doesn't say anything, basically. It's like, here's the chapters that had some that you should consider. So this is really all that they've offered so far. This couple of questions here. And what we're about to do now is participate in this roundtable on September 22nd at 4 p.m. And we'll give all the details of that in a minute, to give feedback on this draft racial equity analysis tool, right? So this is what they've put out for feedback. And here I'm gonna go into some of the thoughts that we have, and we'd love your input as well as your support to come up with, the best recommendations possible. But here's what we were given. A couple of questions. What are the expected goals of the zoning action? What are the anticipated positive and negative impacts? And then it goes into a couple of, areas to define direct displacement, housing. What is it? Affordable housing, physical, environmental aspects, access to opportunity. As you see, this is very vague, right? There's no real specific questions. There's no specific data being used or required to be used. And so I think it would, it's clear to us that it doesn't meet the standards of the comp plan that Alex had just reviewed again, and I can go back to remind us, but again, those 4 bullet points, right? Consider past and current inequities, disaggregate data, etc. And so we'll go back to that. But our first talking point is simple, right? For this upcoming roundtable, the proposed racial equity tool is insufficient and not substantive enough to lead to meaningful change and equitable development outcomes. It does not meet comprehensive plan requirements. That's, I hope we all agree on that. Then we have some additional points that for us have come up through reviewing this, but also just, this topic as a whole. Meaningful involvement of the people most impacted is a core tenet of equity. If you talk about environmental justice, it's a key piece, meaningful involvement, as well as racial equity. So while this needs to be defined in some way, both within the zoning, the development review, but as well within the zoning process as a whole, we would like to require community engagement early in the development process and ongoing throughout it. We would like to require that there be qualitative data, meaning feedback input, as well as quantitative, not just numbers, right? And we would like to note that if a zoning decision inherently changes the ability of impacted people to give input into the future, that is inequitable. So I'm going to give you as a quick example, the Berry Farm redevelopment. Berry Farm was a PUD, it was a planned unit development, which had hearings and had, the potential for community benefit agreement to be attached, et cetera. But then it changed into a map amendment. Once they did a map amendment, they approved all of the future buildings basically ahead of time, years ahead of time. So the idea is that the developers will not have to go back to zoning and make application for each building in the future, which forecloses the chance for residents to come then into a setting where they could negotiate community benefits, raise issues with affordability levels, or otherwise have an audience and have people on the record about whether people are coming back, right? How many people have come back? And so in that process, we argued that at least zoning commission, at least in your map and text amendments, incorporate the residents' right to return, codify it, put it in your order so that it's in another place where the residents can point to and say, no, it's codified here, but I have been denied if they are denied. And we were told, and this was after the passage of the comp plan and this new requirement, it was last December, that was not in their purview and that they were not going to be, putting right to return in their order. For us, that would have been a great example of how to advance racial equity within this zoning process. And so that was I think a real misstep. And I think for me, it just really opened my eyes to this type of zoning decision that could have, it now sets the tone for development over the course of probably the next 15 to 20 years. But there's no formal process anymore for the impacted people to participate. Next talking point is that we want to make sure this racial equity analysis is required for all zoning decisions. That is what the comp plan says. It should not just be for contested cases or cases where there's an application. It should be for the map amendments and the text amendments as well. I'm not a zoning attorney, so there may be questions or nuances that other people will have to explain. But the basic thing being that if you're making a change to a zoning rule, you need racial equity analysis. It's not just if you are talking about a specific building, right? And we understand that there's been some attempts to define this differently. So we want to make sure that it is all of those types of cases, whether or not they're contested cases as well. We do need measures of accountability. If racial equity analysis is not conducted, what happens? Because unfortunately, we expect that there may not be that there may be attempts to undermine the racial equity analysis. Meaningful assessment of displacement risk. The tool specifically says on-site displacement. That means they're only addressing if there are people in that property who would be displaced. It does. So here's our take on this. One, we need a tool to assess displacement risk. It's not just the developer saying nobody lives here right now. Okay, because there's so many nuances about displacement. We need more specific questions that guide the assessment of displacement risk. And we don't want to limit this to on-site or direct displacement, as they call it. We want it to be, we want to consider a impact zone around the project, and other jurisdictions have used a quarter of mile. In a little bit, we'll hear a little bit about a case study from another city that's doing that. And I don't think I need to argue this with you all, but as you know, you put a big building, it does have a ripple effect, right? It does encourage land speculation around it. It does increase property values and property taxes. And so there is an impact of these projects. And I know in the past, the developers and the zoning commission have been really intent that we're just looking at this one site. Well, we can't do that if we're going to talk about racial equity. There is a broader impact. If there's a site across the street that is, at risk, that is, this big development is going to exacerbate that risk. And so there should be measures put into place to address that. But the first step is, even just acknowledging it, assessing the displacement risk. We want to use current and historic data and track and report outcomes. Of course, that was made clear in the comp plan as well, but it's not clear in the commission's tool, right? So we need transparent use of data disaggregated by race, separated by race, to identify past and present inequities. We have yet to develop those tools. So we're already behind, right? We want to then track outcomes and measure advancement in equity. This is another piece that hasn't been made totally clear, even in the comp plan. We're not just doing this as a semantic exercise. We want meaningful changes in people's lives. So how are we tracking our progress? At what point are we going to say we've advanced racial equity? Right now, we can't measure that. We're not tracking, we can't measure it. We don't have data, we don't have goals, we can't track it. So one area, for instance, that we could start to measure is closing the racial wealth gap. Affordability data has to be set in the context of the median income of Black families in the target area. We all know the problem with area median income, AMI. We're being told, 60% is affordable, 60% of AMI, 80% of AMI, sometimes even 100% of AMI. And we may be building in an area where, well, first of all, citywide, the median income for Black families is less than 50% AMI. So if we're at 60, we're not hitting the median income for Black families at all. But in an area, it might be at 30 or 40. So if we're talking about affordability, of course, that's very subjective. And if we're talking about racial equity, we have to be clear. Is this affordable to the group of people that we say we're trying to, eliminate the inequities? I also want to urge us to consider priority groups and vulnerable populations. And this is in part because of the health impact of development. Think about people with disabilities, people who have, is this a community that has high asthma rates and respiratory illness? Is there going to be a lot of construction debris and dust? How is this going to impact the people surrounding it? A great example of this is in Buzzard Point, where the Cyfax public housing community is. There was a lot of construction, including the Audi Stadium. And, people are living in homes without ventilation systems, and one small measure that people had to fight for was to get some air purifiers that they could put in their homes so that they weren't, their respiratory illness that was very rampant wasn't being made worse because of all the trucks and dust and debris. Another special population is DC natives. I mean, talking for myself, but maybe many of you agree, to say, well, we have, increased Black home ownership. Okay, cool. Have we done it for DC natives? Because what we have found, what we have seen, is that DC natives are often not benefiting from some of the programs. We may have people coming into the city who could benefit from some of the programs, but we're still experiencing as a city, high poverty rates in many communities among people who are Native Washingtonians, multi-generational. And I think we do need to be, in many cases, more intentional about uplifting our own, looking at our own communities, not just being, okay, somebody can come move in and take advantage, and that's fine. But like, what are we addressing the barriers that we experience with our own DC natives? So that's just a couple of examples. We want to require applicants to take actions that advance equity before they even come to the zoning commission. If you have defined that there's a displacement risk, if you have identified that there is racial equity issues, you should be then required to make some adaptations to your project. And there is a case study in Boston, which we'll hear about in a minute, where this is starting to happen. So there's a sort of a menu of things. Hey, you're in a displacement risk area. Here's a menu of things. Choose one of these before you come to get your project reviewed. And it just would start the ball rolling to make some positive changes. We want to make the zoning process accessible. And as I said before, an equitable process cannot lead to an equitable outcome. So if the majority of people impacted by development in the city know nothing about zoning, have no real support to engage in the zoning process, I think any of you who have done this before, I think could agree that it's a very difficult process to navigate. Even trying to figure out what the cases are, the website, everything is difficult. But also notice and standing rules need to be amended, and we can't be relying just on digital tools when we know that digital exclusion is still a big issue. And I think I'm towards the end, and I'm going to open it up here. We want, Alex kind of spoke to this, but with the Office of Planning is actually charged with supporting the Zoning Commission in its development review, right? So it's the Office of Planning that does a lot of the analysis. And but there's different divisions within the Office of Planning. There's the community planners, which actually engage with community in the sense that they have to. They do the small area plans, they're more familiar with the communities. And then there's the zoning division that is more likely, behind the scenes, they're not in direct relationship with communities. We feel strongly that racial equity analysis should be placed within the community planners, not within the people that advise zoning. And we understand that this is part of comprehensive plan consistency. However, to assess whether there is racial equity impact takes people who understand the community and can communicate with the community, especially if we're requiring that there be ongoing community engagement and qualitative as well as quantitative input. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second. We're going to go into a couple of tools, but I do want to just open it for a moment for feedback and thoughts on those recommendations. And I'm going to start with Chairman Mendelson. Chairman, I'd love to hear, your sort of feedback on what the Zoning Commission has put forward, as well as any response you may have to our recommendations this far, and anything else you're thinking of to make this happen in a meaningful way.
Well, I came more as in a listening mode than in a speaking mode.
Okay.
And this is helpful to me to, first of all, remember what we did with the comprehensive plan. And second, to see how this is being perceived, what the Zoning Commission is doing. I do have to say that when you put the slide up earlier about what the Zoning Commission is proposing, one of the slides didn't seem to mention race at all. And when we talk about equity in the city, or racial equity in the city, we are kind of talking about race. I've mentioned low income as well, but I got to talk about race. But I think I'm going to just leave it there. I really came more in a listening mode. And I'm finding this very helpful. I do want to add this, only because it may not have been made clear earlier. The mayor does draft and propose a comprehensive plan. When it went to the council, we made two major changes. And when I say two, I don't mean like on page 3, we did something, and on page 8, we did something. We changed the emphasis considerably for more of a focus on housing and affordable housing, and also put into the plan this racial equity requirement. And that was not in what the mayor proposed. Don't know that that's necessarily a criticism, because what she had drafted, I think, came to us before 2020, and will changed a bit when 2020 happened.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. And I do think that's a good point, especially when we realize that the Office of Planning, which is under the mayor, is a critical piece of carrying this out. And yes, the mayor, this wasn't her idea. So we often feel that it's difficult sometimes to get agencies to really take action on something if it's not the mayor's priority. And so far, we have not seen that this is the mayor's priority. It may or may not be, but we have not seen that. And we do appreciate the work that you did, Chairman, and the council to put this in there before. And I appreciate you being here in listening mode as well. I do. I just have one question. I know that the next comp plan will be a rewrite, and I think it's scheduled for 2025. Do you have are you starting to think about that, or is that true? Is it 2025? Or what thoughts? What should we know about that?
As to the date, that sounds right, but it's set forth in the comprehensive plan legislation. So anybody can go to the legislation and see the schedule. And my recollection is that the Office of Planning will take a year and a half or 2 years before it gets presented to the council. I will say as well that the current plan is maybe 1,000 pages, and it is to hope. And we tried to express in the legislation the intention that the next plan, the rewrite, be considerably shorter.
Right, which means that we'll have to work hard to make sure the important stuff stays there and doesn't get stripped out.
Yes, but it also means that something that's important doesn't need to be stated 5 or 6 times throughout the plan. That actually, unless stated exactly the same way, can lead to confusion.
Got it. So I want to open it up for a few minutes of conversation, comment, and then we are going to hear about a couple of tools that other cities are using that we're recommending. If you have a comment now, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand. And Nancy, I see your hand.
Just as the chairman's point about whether people of color are mentioned in the questions that the Office of Planning has created for its racial equity tool. I read 3 of the racial equity statements that had been submitted since the tool has been implemented. One was a PUD, one was a map amendment, one was a modification of a PUD, and also I had a map amendment. In every single one of them, the term people of color was not mentioned. Black and brown residents was not mentioned. Low income residents was not mentioned. Unemployment was not mentioned. It seemed clear to me that an applicant could navigate this tool and be responsive without ever hitting the points that are necessary to discuss if you're serious about changing the nature of racial equity in the district. I think it's incredibly disappointing. So I will just leave it at that.
Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate that. Yeah, we did review some of those documents as well. And as I was saying earlier, so far it's been a joke. So far it's been completely meaningless. So we do have a lot of work to do. And I think, Chairman, I appreciate your point. Like this is about racial inequity. We have to name race. I mean, that's one of the first steps, right, to tackling these issues. Chris Otten?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can. We're good.
Okay, great. I wanted to speak to one of those PUDs. It's up in Ward 1, and that's where I live. And I heard about it. I read the order. Here's the situation. I mean, and this is for everybody on this call. If you read the order for 1611 at the Zoning Commission, you can go to the website and look up the case number, dcoz.dc.gov. Basically, the Zoning Commission, with the help of the Office of Planning, and ultimately with the verbiage used by Holland and Knight, which is a attorney, the #1 zoning firm in the United States that many of the developers in this city hire to go to the Zoning Commission. Their verbiage, it's worse than meaningless. It's harmful because it's attempting to redefine racial equity as racial equality. So in other words, since we're building some affordable housing, that will be available to everybody. Everybody gets to participate in this project. And so it's harmful because you can't have racial equality, right, without repairing the harms of the past. And that's where the racial equity is supposed to be coming in. It's acknowledging how these projects have been displacing people and how they're supposed to be reflecting, you know, a repair of that in an attempt to not harm people, so that we can get to some racial equality. Racial equity precedes racial equality, but they're redefining racial equity in these orders now that have come out before this tool, before we're even discussing this. So that's the other harm here is they put out this one pager. We're going to react to it. It's going to take them another 3, 4, 5, who knows how many months to actually pull in our comments. And meanwhile, all of these applications are in the pipeline to go through, and they're being approved right now, as just mentioned. And Mr. Mendelson, sounds like you're not watching. A lot of people aren't watching. I mean, we're just not seeing how this is going. So that's the accountability I think Parisa was talking about. And we really have to get there because they're redefining fundamental planning concepts that are born out of communities of color for the last 2 decades into things that are meaningless. So it's quite harmful. And I think everybody should look at that case when you get a chance. 1611. Thank you.
If you can put a link in the chat, that would be great. We're gonna get a couple more of these questions here in a minute, but I want to go ahead and invite Nate Fleming to share with us. Nate has been helping us with a review of policies around the country. What are other cities doing? And so he's going to share a couple of the best practices that he's identified so far. And you're muted, Nate.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we can. You can. You might want to put the slideshow view so we can see it.
Okay, hold on. I might not be able to put it to slideshow view because it'll make me not be able to see myself.
I see. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Is that, can you see the
Yes.
slides?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll just briefly, we've been looking at models throughout the United States, and the 2 models that were most instructive were models out of New York City and Boston. And out of New York really demonstrates the importance of having data. Their law requires an equitable data tool that has citywide, borough-wide, census-level data along categories such as demographic conditions, household economic security, access to opportunity, the housing production in that area, and there's a displacement risk index. And this displacement risk index seeks to find areas that are at risk of displacement through looking at indicators such as race, income, the share of house units that are rent burdened, the share of households experiencing rent burdens, trends as it relates to house prices and rents, and the share of housing units that have 3 or more maintenance deficiencies. And as a result, New York City requires certain land use applications to require racial equity reports that are filed by the applicant. And these reports must list things like the number of units that are affordable by affordable unit type. So number of extremely low income units, the number of very low income units, the number of moderate income units, and the expected rents of the anticipated project, as well as the household incomes that are needed to afford those units without incurring additional housing cost burden. Non-residential uses are required to look at the type of jobs that are going to be at the site and look at the median wage of those jobs and the racial and ethnic composition of those sectors. It's also important to understand in New York, they localize all of their decisions by understanding the community profile. So they look at a summary of the data of a half mile of the project site, looking at things like the income levels, the affordable housing categories, and trends as it relates to that. Boston takes it a step further in that they've combined fair housing and zoning regulations, and they do require reports as well. But their reports must demonstrate, the applicant must demonstrate how their projects will not harm area residents who have historically been discriminated against. And the purpose of their project is to let applicants share the burden in taking the steps that will reduce those impacts and provide more housing opportunities and address past histories of exclusion. So as a result, projects in Boston, one must include a narrative description of how the project will work to overcome segregation and foster inclusive communities. Secondly, it must include an assessment of historic exclusion and displacement risk. And they use a tool, which is pretty much a thorough substantive questionnaire that highlights a lot of these points and indicators. So projects then have to select from a list of intervention menus that are in the zoning code. So Boston takes it a step further and they require applicants to affirmatively select interventions that are designed to reduce displacement risk and to advance equitable development. So some of the examples of these interventions are deepening the affordability of units beyond what was otherwise required, or providing a higher number of accessible units than were otherwise required, or exceeding the percentage of family units that are required, or exceeding the number of units that are accessible to housing choice vouchers. So there's a list of things that applicants are essentially required to accept. If a project is in a high displacement risk zone, they're required to pick from a list of interventions to reduce displacement risk. So that's a quick look at New York and Boston, and then I'll just close with a quick survey of what's being done in other jurisdictions that we thought was interesting. So right next door in Montgomery County, they've developed equity focus areas. So they've mapped areas in the county that have a high concentration of low income and low English proficiency households as a way to categorize areas that need special attention and special policy interventions to increase equity. So that's an example of making sure that we're using mapping tools and making sure that we're identifying areas of high displacement risk. In Montgomery County, all zoning text amendments require racial equity and social justice impact statements, similar to the racial equity statements that are required for certain measures at the DC Council. Zoning measures in Montgomery County also have a similar requirement where racial equity is assessed by a government body and they make recommendations before certain zoning actions. It's important to set baseline conditions. As we saw, King County in Washington is a good example of that, but I'll skip through just for the sake of time. And Louisville, Kentucky, this is a good example of a city that incorporates a community-specific history of racism into their analysis. And that's important because that shows that actions are going to be informed by this research. So in Louisville, Kentucky, this map is actually a map that maps out historic segregation patterns for over the past century in Louisville. And so that historic mapping of redlining practices is used to inform their zoning and their land use decisions. In Seattle, Washington, and they are a good example of using these displacement and access to opportunity indexes to inform zoning decisions. So this is a map that maps out Seattle as it relates to equity priority areas. But what's very interesting about what they've been doing is that they juxtapose two tools. One is a tool that seeks to assess displacement risk, and another tool is a tool that seeks to assess access to opportunity. So the displacement risk tool uses factors that increase the risk of marginal populations being displaced. So that's, for example, the percentage of households that are cost burdened in an area, or it looks at historical trends as relates to rents in the area. And then they have an access to opportunity index that includes factors that contribute to social and economic physical well-being. So that's things like graduation rates, access to high quality schools, access to green spaces, access to community assets. And what they do is they juxtapose those two tools to categorize neighborhoods in 4 ways. So neighborhoods are categorized as high displacement risk, low access to opportunity, high displacement risk, high access to opportunity, low displacement risk, low access to opportunity, and then low displacement risk, high access to opportunity. And so to close, what they do is in each category of neighborhood, they have different growth strategies. For example, an area that's low displacement risk, but has high access to opportunity, a key part of that growth strategy in an area like that is making sure that those areas are accessible to all. But in a neighborhood that is categorized as high displacement risk and low access to opportunity, that would be a neighborhood that we would prioritize with equity policies. And they also use these categories to predict certain zoning decisions or certain land use approaches, and then they assess this displacement risk in the city based upon these categories. So for example, in Seattle, they have the choice of doing their development by focusing on urban villages, development around urban villages, or development around their light rail system. And so what they'll do is they'll predict the outcomes if we took the approach of the growth village, and then they'll juxtapose that against the approach that if they took the light rail approach, and then they see and they assess the displacement risk across all of these categories. So that's just a good example of the host of tools that are out there. And it shows how many jurisdictions are much more robust about how we approach this. And I think one of the key things that we do need to echo in the hearing is, like the chairman said, the lack of a discussion of race in the racial equity assessment tool. I think that speaks most profoundly about the lack of substance in the current tool that OZ has. So that's it for me. Thank you, Parisa.
Thank you so much, Nate. Okay, so I'm gonna open it up for conversation here. I just want to make sure we set first the information that you need to sign up for this roundtable. I hope many of you will be there. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to understand all of these things that we've been discussing. You just, I think, need to be there to say this is needed, but what you've proposed is not enough. And we'll give you like an outline of some just sort of how you might construct your statement. I want to ask Paul Johnson to just first share with you all how to sign up. So if Paul, you want to unmute, you can do that.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I will share my screen. Okay, great. Can you see? Okay, great. Yes, I'm Paul Johnson with Empower, and we have here the screen at the Office of Zoning. signing up to testify. Believe everyone can see it. And the web address is on the flyer and communications that we've sent out. It's dcoz.dc.
Put it in the chat.
Okay, great. So we hit the button, sign up to testify. And then we're taken to the ISIS system, which has a title on the top. It has contact individuals, Ella Ackerman at the Zoning Commission. As Alex explained earlier, this is not a BZA issue, it's a zoning issue. We're down here at these boxes here, the witness sign up form. If we go to this, and also too, anyone is welcome to sign up now if they would so wish. And if you need support in doing this, we're available to help that as well, I should say. So we're going to the Zoning Commission in terms of selecting the type. And then in terms of selecting an event, this is the Zoning Commission's public roundtable on the 22nd. So it's this choice here. You click on it here, and the case number is 22RT1. But to make it easier, there's only one selection here in the drop-down menu for select the case. And we click on this. And then we include our your witness name, your last name, your phone number, your organization, your email. I'm gonna move my panel box over here. Testimony type. I believe, Parisa, we would put undeclared. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, typically that's for contested cases. Are you for the development or opposed? Not for a roundtable like this. So I put undeclared. I would say that another way to interpret it might be, do you like their tool or not? So, but it's up to you how you want to respond there.
Right. And then you see in red, you have to swear and affirm you're speaking the truth. You hit you do, and then you submit. And then you will get a confirmation email. And our wonderful ANC and activist and longtime policy Maven Renee Bowser has allowed me to show you her confirmation email that you see on the screen. And what I would just want to point to your attention is that if you are submitting written testimony, which we encourage you to do, whatever written testimony or documents you submit need to be submitted 24 hours prior to the start of the hearing, either through ISIS or by email. That's very important because we want to make sure that this gets in on the record. And then you'll see here that there's strict participation guidelines, which you will find here. I don't really think I need to read through this or just show the participation guideline page. So I will. So this is the participation guidelines. It talks about if you misplace the link and the phone number access, where can you go? And this speaks to that. How will I know? Well, this is a BZA case, it doesn't apply.
I don't think we need all that, but here's the virtual hearing information about virtual hearings is here. I think the key thing is, you have 3 minutes to speak, 5 minutes if you're representing an organization. I guess that would include ANC, I'm assuming.
If you're an ANC, you have more time. So you would have 5 minutes. And if you're not, you'd have 3.
So I would love to just see, some indication of who's planning to be present at the roundtable. I see Lori's hand. I see Jamie, Nancy. Let's see, Alma, fantastic. Tanya, William. Andrea? Great. Alex, Renee? This will be great. Nate? It'll be really important. You know, I think it's important to have a strong turnout. Oh, you can watch the proceedings on YouTube. They have a live stream on YouTube. We'll send a follow-up email with all of those links. But if you register, even if, again, your statement is very brief, to participate and so that they see you as a participator, not, you know, just passively watching it on the YouTube. I think it's really important for them to see that a lot of people are really watching this and wanting to see it go well. Paul, when you get a second, can you put in the chat the email address to send the testimony to? So you can also just send your written testimony to have it in the record to an email address. And so he'll put that in the chat here in a second. Okay, so I see a couple of questions in the chat. Can one submit a statement if unable to attend? Yes, you can. And so we'll put that in there in a second. And there's the email address I just mentioned. Nancy had something in the chat talking about the racial equity tool doesn't list the framework or implementation elements where the majority of the discussion of racial equity is. It doesn't specifically mention those as the elements that the applicants should look at to find consistency. Is that an error? Does it make the job of getting meaningful racial equity analysis implemented, I guess, tougher? Any feedback on that? I don't know, Alex or anybody at OAG. Do you think we should, mention that in the talking points? That I mean, I think that their tool is so deficient that I'm not sure that is but that might be one of the many things that we would want to bring up. Alex, what do you think?
I mean, I'll sort of let that, I mean, everybody, as you said, sort of can file what they feel is most appropriate. I do think, it is worth calling out those sections, Parisa, that you had in your slides, and some of the sections that we called out on ours. I think that provides some of the more specific language about racial equity. So I think that is helpful for people to refer to, both in organizing their thoughts and, presenting it to the commission, if that makes sense.
I know the chairman needs to leave here in a minute. I do want to thank you, Chairman, for being here and look forward to working with your office to make sure that this is done in a meaningful way. I do think it's important for the council to pay attention, even still after it's out of your hands technically. So appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Let's see, I'm trying to make sure I'm not losing questions in the chat, but feel free to also raise your hand at this point. Okay, Tanya, is the strategy for us to reinforce similar points? Okay, or divide up the points. I'm okay with either, but reminds me that, I have a little outline. Let me share that with you. Let me go here. Okay, so here's the email address to submit your testimony, zcsubmissions@dc.gov, zcsubmissions@dc.gov, and that's the phone number. If you don't want to go through the online tool to sign up, you want to just call somebody and sign up, this is the phone number. So again, 202-727-0789. Here's what we were thinking for testimony. I mean, again, it's really your comfort level, whatever you prefer, but to be there to introduce yourself, share why this is important to you or important to DC, state that the draft tool is inadequate and does not meet the standards of the comprehensive plan. So there's that, clear statement. Then you could cite some of the harms that you hope would be addressed, or some of the data that you hope would be analyzed, some of the outcomes that you hope would be gained through the racial equity tool. Whatever you're most comfortable with. I don't expect anybody to be an expert in this area, but I think we can all say, hey, I really was hoping that this was going to talk about, that as we do this analysis, we're going to have this type of data, or we're going to see these types of outcomes, these types of changes. And for me, like, this should be no more building as usual, right? This should be a change in the status quo. It shouldn't just be additional words, but we still have the status quo outcomes, right? So like here would be a place where you could say, this is the type of changes I'm expecting to see as we make, you know, as we do meaningful racial equity analysis. If you were directly impacted specifically by a development project and you wanted to refer back to that and say how it was inequitable and how you would hope it would be different now, that I think that would be great. Even if you weren't impacted, but if you were tracking a development like that, then you could cite, yes, something in our recommendations or some of your own recommendations that you want to highlight, anything that really speaks to you, maybe the displacement risk area being one key one. I can go back and I put in the chat a document that lists all of the recommendations that we have, as well as all of the tools that Nate just went through. So I can put that link again, but just so you could refer back to that. And then I think ending by just stating that the tools and processes must be made mandatory through a zoning text amendment, and there needs to be accountability and reporting of outcomes. And we say that because right now, this is not in the zoning code. It's in the comp plan, but it's not in the zoning code. And so we want to define it, like what is it, should it be, and then put it in the zoning code. So it is the, you know, the law, it's the regulations, it's standard practice for what is required within zoning. It's not up for interpretation any longer, you know. What is the comp plan really saying? No, we're defining it. These are the steps you take, and it's in the zoning code. Of course, we don't want their tool as written to be that, but we want it beefed up and then put it in there. Andrea, is your hand up for a comment or question? Okay. Okay. So Jamie, comment or question?
Yeah, I had a question. Thank you. So I live in Woodley Park in Ward 3, Rock Creek West, where there's very little chance of displacement because it's the historic policies of, you know, redlining and excluding people and all that that have caused this to be a largely white area. I wonder if anything in your recommendations, which, you know, I want to support in my testimony, gets to that question, like how do we increase racial equity by desegregating parts of the city where displacement isn't really the issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd love to open it up. I know Nate's one option is to focus on that opportunity area. And so this is an area where it's, you know, it's not the displacement, but it's the opportunity that we need to bring, you know, create focus on how do we move towards racial equity by creating opportunities within this high opportunity area. Any other comments on that? Any suggestions for what Ward 3 housing justice, folks that are really active in Ward 3 and want to push for deeply affordable housing, what they could call for? Tanya, were you responding to that?
Yeah, and I'm not a Ward 3 resident, but I was thinking that one way, like if your desired outcome is that there be more affordable housing in Ward 3, then one way to think about making a proposal would be to say something where the equity tool would lead to that. So for example, is this an area that needs affordable housing, or will this area increase the percentage of low income residents by a significant amount? But anyway, think about like what the outcome is that you want, right? And then think about how a rule could be created that in the racial equity tool that would lead to that outcome. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does to me, Tanya. Great. I see William Jordan and then Chris Otten, so I want to go ahead and make some space for them. William?
Yeah, so sorry for being late, but part of it is the importance of doing an analysis, right? Because just as she said, what is needed in any particular case may vary, right? So we're trying to move away from these broad brush conclusions affordable housing isn't always the best solution. Sometimes it's affordable housing, but it's for sale versus rental. Sometimes it's employment opportunities and those things. So what we want to happen is for a real analysis to occur and for the zoning commission to have to respond to that analysis in their rulings, in their cases. So currently, they basically say we can make it up. It doesn't matter. We can do whatever we want to do. But fine, but you still have to do an analysis. And I think that's the key out of all of this, that they really do have to do an analysis, and that analysis has to be meaningful. Because the zoning commission in 1611, as Chris has talked about, said the Corps is incompetent to do a racial equity analysis. So the only functioning entity in the city that's doing analysis, the zoning commission says it's not competent to do it and they don't have to pay attention to it. So what we're fighting for is real fundamental kind of things here.
Yeah, and I think Renee's point also, if you add the historic data about, clearly there's been a lot of displacement of Black residents from Ward 3. I mean, there was whole communities that were, their land was stolen from them. So, I mean, there is maybe not direct displacement on site today, but there is the history of that. And there is and I think I really like the idea of having sort of a menu of actions that the developer needs to take depending on, is it that you're in a displacement risk area, or is it you're in a high opportunity area? But either way, like, you have to respond to this analysis and do something more. And I know, maybe so, focusing on that, we would want developers in our area as a result of this analysis to do this, to add, additional deeply affordable units, to create, whatever the things are that you all, I know, already have identified. I want to just put this slide up here. Our next steps, of course, the roundtable, but that's just step one. This is the beginning conversation. We're still going to have to work over the next several months, right, to make sure that this is developed, the tool is developed, that it's turned into a text amendment. We may end up working with OAG to introduce a text amendment that reflects the type of analysis that we believe is needed, because we don't know what Office of Planning is going to come up with, what the Zoning Commission is going to come up with, or how long it's going to take them to do it. As Chris was pointing out, they're moving forward on cases right now, and they're not doing the analysis that we need. So, we encourage you to join Empower DC's Equitable Development Working Group. We're meeting regularly with OAG and continuing to do this work. So feel free to reach out to Paul or myself to get help with your statement, as well as to join that effort. Chris Otten, and then Ronald.
Yes, Parisa, I was for the roundtable, Nate's research, I think, would be really critical. I would love to pull a few of the things from the menus of the different cities that they're doing to say, look, this is what we need to do. Because in Ward 3, to Jamie's point, I'm looking at what's happening already now. After our hard work to get the racial equity even acknowledged in the plan, how has the planning apparatus responded? Well, it shows in sort of the projects that are lining up Wisconsin Avenue now and Connecticut Avenue. The failure to do anything at the Wardman beyond the most minimum affordability requirements. The same thing up at Friendship Heights. I mean, the posture of the city at this point is the status quo as it's been. It's like, just meet the bare minimum 8% affordable housing requirements. So out of 100 units, you build 8 that are affordable for people making $65,000 plus a year, right? So that's their posture right now. So this work we're doing now, will reset this status quo posture that clearly, even though we got in the plan and we made these points, and why it's in the plan was because of our efforts, it's sort of has gone, in terms of the implementation, we know that the status quo is what they want to continue to perpetrate. And I think it's such a lost opportunity, especially in Ward 3, to have it really emphasize that the amenities and the things in these new projects should be totally geared towards, alternatives like social housing and land trust and truly affordable housing, but we're not seeing that yet. So this work is so important. I really appreciate you, Parisa, and Nate and the crew.
Yeah, we just put that back in the chat again, the link. The document has, it's not the slides that he was showing, but it's the same information. It actually has links to go see the websites and places that he was talking about. Last comments, because we're at 2:30. So Ronald and then Laura. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I'll be very quick. And I was echoing Chris in Ward 3 in terms of what has not happened in terms of racial equity. And it's almost a test bed. When you apply racial equity and see the change in places like the Wardman Marriott area where that hasn't happened. So you want to look at active efforts going on in housing and see what can be done, and then measure that to see if maybe the tool can be introduced in an effective way, maybe not the whole thing. You did mention you're disappointed in the process, Parisa, originally, and everybody is. And I think if we pay attention to the process and make sure it's logical and you get a result and you can follow up and make sure what you're saying actually happens, we'll all be a lot better off. I'm also going to recommend, I'm going to write my testimony because 3 minutes goes awful fast, as everybody will find out. So I just want to make sure everybody understands when they go in front of the round table, it's going to be the fastest 3 minutes of your life, or maybe 5 minutes. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And Laura Richards. You're on mute if you're talking. And then we'll end with Renee. Okay, go ahead, Laura. Yeah. Lori, are you there? We don't hear you. I see you unmuted, but we still aren't hearing you. So I'm going to go to Renee, Laura, and then see if we can get you here in a second. Renee?
My comment was just a process. It seems like when in the instructions for the roundtable, when it has underlined in bold that your testimony must be 24 hours before the hearing, I'm going to try to get some clarity on that, because that is unlike most hearings, though any of the hearings I've ever been to over the years. And if you think you're going to testify, then write something out, it seems like what they're emphasizing is the record's closing at the end of the hearing, and that could be a trap, because I know a lot of times you testify in person, then you write something up and send it in, or you have your draft and you send it in afterwards. So I'm going to try to find out when the record closes.
Yeah, my experience is that usually the record closes the day of the hearing, unless they state otherwise, unless they say, we're going to keep the record open. Now, Alex, you may have more.
I mean, I think that's a great question, Renee. It's definitely worth clarifying. I mean, this is to a degree being conducted like a traditional zoning hearing, but it's a roundtable at the end of the day. So the commission is not making a decision at the end of next Thursday. So I think, and again, I think worth clarifying with the Office of Zoning or with the commission on Thursday as to whether they will leave the record open. I think there's probably a better chance of them being willing to do that. I know, at least in their public meeting on the 8th, Chairman Hood was pretty clear in talking about the roundtable that he does want to make sure that everybody who wants to participate is able to and is able to get their comments in. So it's worth clarifying, but I think there might be a little bit more flexibility with this than there would be in a traditional zoning hearing.
I think we can also ask specifically that they keep the record open, and I would imagine that they would be willing to do that. There may be an error in my document that I sent the link to, but just to be clear, the roundtable is Thursday the 22nd at 4 p.m. I will make sure that is corrected, but just make sure we know it's this Thursday, 4 p.m. Laura, are we able to hear you now? You want to try again? Okay. We're not hearing you. So we're going to close because we're after time. I do want to mention we have a second info session scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10. It's just 1 hour. If there's others that you want to encourage to come, please, I'll send out a follow-up email by tomorrow to everybody from today's meeting with all of these documents and links, and the link for Tuesday that you could share with others. Really appreciate you being part of this. By no means do we have all the answers, but I think the best thing is just to be part of this, right? Like at least all of our brains together, we can come up with some good stuff and definitely demonstrate that people are watching, that we need this to be done. We need it to be done right. And we need to, we're going to be working outside of this process, right? Like I said, roundtable is step one. We want to work on the zoning text amendments, but also we need to work on the council, right? They need to do more as well. And some of it needs to be in legislative efforts that create some of these changes that we need to see as well. So thank you, everybody. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Sorry to be late, but good
Bye,
session.
everybody.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Very helpful.